to make sure that we are able to grade everyone consistently at the same time. If you have any questions about anything related to the course, office hours and WPL hours are available for asking them. Check the calendar for times, Ed for Zoom links. We're available. Please make use of us and ask us questions and get some clarification on whatever we talk about. And quiz 1 on Friday. I'll talk briefly about that momentarily. Couple notes on lecture. I do recognize, and we all recognize that we've been spending a lot of time on Q&A and not as much on content. And Q&A is great, as I've mentioned, and I love answering your questions, and I love having you ask the questions, and I like that you feel comfortable asking the questions in the chat. But we do need to balance it with actually getting through content. So I'm going to try to set a little bit of a line where I'll try to address questions from chat that are immediately relevant to whatever content I just talked about. So brief clarifications, brief additions of information, but not much more. Anything else? We've got a bunch of TAs in the chat. We've got a couple, Tal and Connor, who are watching it to address your questions there, and so anything outside of that, I'll leave to them. And I say this now, but next week we're going to be changing things up a little bit when Andrew takes over. So I'll also use that as a reminder that we do have 2 instructors, myself and Andrew, and we're going to be switching off who's running lecture every 2 weeks. So my 2 weeks are almost up, and then it'll be Andrew, and then I'll come in 2 weeks after that. So that'll be a thing. Today, we're going to be spending a lot of time in Chrome and Chrome's DevTools. And so while I have the slides presented here, and I will keep presenting this Chrome window, the slides are largely going to be reference. And so there's a lot of information here. There's tons of slides here. I'm not going to be going over all of them today. So if you're watching on the recording and wondering why I didn't talk about slide 53 or whatever the number is, it's because we're spending most of it in Chrome. So just wanted to clarify that. Quiz question. So here's an example one. So as mentioned a number of different times throughout lecture, there's lots of information on the internet about everything, as we know. And Stack Overflow, if you're not familiar, is basically the website for how professional developers do their job. It's kind of in jest, but in some ways, like, it's the resource that we use to look information up and get answers to things. And it's a wonderful resource from just the software development community at large to get things answered. So if we go to look at this particular CSS or Stack Overflow question, it's asking about border radius, and there's lots of different options. Which one do I particularly use? And it's got some answers here. It's like, yeah, you can use that if you're on a Gecko browser, and you can use WebKit border radius if you're on a WebKit browser. And so it's got some caveats here, but it's really easy to look at this and say, okay, I'd like to create a nice rounded border. And which one do I use? Oh, well, this first one says that I should just use that. Moz is short for Mozilla, which is the creator of Firefox. And so I'm like, I'm not on Firefox, so therefore I'm going to use the WebKit one. Great, I'm going straight down in order and taking this recommendation. The potential example for the quiz. So it's correct. You can use those CSS tags to style a border radius, but it's not necessarily correct according to our code quality guide. How would you change the answer to make it correct according to our guide? I'll give you a moment to think about it before I show the answer. While we're here, as a reminder, the code quality guide that we follow is from the website. So if you go to our course website and then click on the code quality guide, And all of our recommendations are here. So yes, the kind of answer would more or less be just use border radius. Because if you look at our code quality guide for CSS, there's a section on vendor prefix CSS. And for this course, for our code quality, we recommend not using the vendor specific CSS rules and using the standard CSS rules. And the reason that this person might be recommending this is if you look down here, and I'll make this bigger, I'll make it bigger, bigger. If you look down here, this was answered in 2010. So I did a Google search for how do I do a border radius in CSS, and this is the answer that came up. It's 10 years old. It's over 10 years old. And so at the time that this person wrote the answer, it was absolutely correct that border radius wasn't necessarily accepted into this web standard at that time. And so you might have to use those vendor specific things. However, this was 10 years ago. Code quality has evolved. And for our purposes in the class, we just use border radius, not any of the vendor specific prefixes. Any thoughts or questions on that? This is the kind of thing that you might expect from the quiz. This is the kind of answer you might expect to give on the quiz, where it's just, it's a sentence. We're not looking for much. We're just looking for some sort of indication that you understand what's happening in relation to the question. I'm not seeing any indication of questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. So we're going to wrap up the first module of the course, which is our HTML and CSS. As you likely saw through the short recap video on Monday night is when I posted that. We typically use Flex to lay things out and to get things to be responsive, to size things in a responsive way that can change based on how wide or big the screen is. And it's kind of challenging. Like I went over some of the basic rules, but the easiest way to figure out and overcome that challenge is to sketch out a wireframe of what it might look like when it's smaller, what it might look like when it's bigger, and then see how you can distribute things across a container that is the wrapper around your items that you are moving around. And so the way you do this is to look at your DOM tree, and we have these elements that are nested within each other. From the example, it was I had a div container with a div 0 inside of it. And so in that case, the container became our flex container, our flex box. Within that, it was the children that became the flex items that were the things that we were moving around. And so that is one of the common bugs that we see with Flex, is that it's tempting to look at, I want to move this item around, and so I want this item to flex around, and so I'm going to set display flex on the child. But display flex creates a container that has flex items within it, and so the container is the one that has the rules that move things around. The children, for the most part, can be left alone. I'll momentarily say that a wireframe is a low fidelity drawing of what your website will look like, according to Connor. And yes, absolutely, it's just like a pencil drawing. If I can spend 2 seconds here, this is maybe a low fidelity drawing of, I have a header and I have a picture in the middle of it. It's just a pencil sketch of what you want your web page to be. And one of the temptations after you do this is to look at that and say, well, everything needs to be flexed around in the container. And so I'm going to make everything a flex container to try to move things around as I need. And that makes things even more complicated when you're working with flex. And so we see that sometimes where people make everything a flex container. But what you should strive to do and what you'd aim to do is only use flex for the specific areas where you want to control how it's aligned across the page or up and down the page. If you're just looking at its relationship to things and where they are in the overall hierarchy of the page, it probably doesn't need to be flex. Some of the more common flex properties, you define a container with display flex. You set its direction, so it's a single axis layout container. And so by default, it's a row. You can override it to be a column, and you can flip it to be a reverse of that if you want. So that's how you define the direction. You can move things around on the main axis, so it's left and right for a row or up and down for a column with justify content. And you can change it the opposite of that, the perpendicular axis, what we call the cross axis with align items. These are the more common flex properties. So just a reminder on direction, I've already talked about this, but we have our main and our cross, which our row and column is going to flip it depending on what you want it to be. Various properties for justify content in particular. The main thing to note here is that we are changing the amount of space where that is placed in between the items. We can say that with flex start, all of the space is going to be at the end. With flex end, it's all the way at the beginning. So we're shifting the items around, which moves the space. And then we have our between, around, and evenly. There's a typo here. So between, around, and evenly. I will change that, fix that slide. In order to distribute the space throughout the flex container. Align items is a little bit different. It doesn't have those space between space evenly item properties, yeah, I'll note space evenly is one that's going to, rather than putting an equal, or when we have space between, we have no space on the end or the beginning. Space evenly is going to give a little bit on the end and make sure that we have all of our space evenly distributed throughout, rather than a round, for example, which does have that space on the beginning and the end. It's a different amount of space than it is between the items. And so evenly distributes the space across throughout the entire container, both on the end and the beginning. Around does not. When we are, yes, the last one's a typo. When we are sizing things within a flex container, if they get too big, the container is going to try to shrink them, and it's going to try to get them to come on to only a single line. However, we can override that with flex wrap, and it'll move things onto the next line. Speaking of sizing things, we can use flex grow to grow things, or not pictured here, flex basis, which I showed in the video on Monday night, to change how much space the flex item takes up. And I know I overviewed this really quickly, but there are resources both from the section slides and on the course calendar to get some practice with using Flex. There's a tool, a little game sort of thing called Flexbox Ducky, which is really fun to try to figure out where things are, how they can change in order, and how you can change the space, etc. It's a very nice and useful tool for learning how to use Flex. Okay, so when we first started talking about websites, we talked about these 3 pillars of what a web page consists of. We have the words and the images. We provide those that content with structure via HTML. We give it some style, and as we just learned, some layout where we can move things around with CSS. But we've not yet touched on that behavior piece. And so that's what we're going to start talking about right now. So we've learned for our content, looking at HTML, for our style, looking at CSS. And we kind of briefly talked about inspecting things with our Chrome browser, with our dev tools. So I'm going to close that so we can show how to get to it. And here I have just a really simple HTML page. And there's not a lot to it. If I right click and go to view page source, you can see that I'm not lying. There's not a lot to it. It has a title, it has a style, it has a header and a button, and that's it. And so there's not a lot to it. And when I click on the button, just nothing is happening. It says to click me, but nothing happens. And so one of the ways we can figure out what's going on and to learn more about it is we can right click on it and go down to inspect. What this does is open up the Chrome developer tools. And if you're using something other than Chrome like Firefox, it has a very similar feature, as does Safari, as does Edge. They all have very similar features, mostly named the same things for the most part. And you can see this tool is broken up kind of into those pillars. If I go back to this slide where we have our content, structure, style, and behavior, the tool is somewhat broken up in the same way. At the top, we have, and if you make this bigger or smaller, the directions are going to change a little bit. But at the top, we have our content with the structure intermixed into it. So we have our HTML in this first box. In the middle box, that's where our style is. And here's our friend, the box model, showing us where all of the sizing is in relation to the button. And Chrome DevTools does a very nice job at highlighting which part of the box is which part. So the content is just the text, for example. It also has all of our CSS. Most of this is auto-generated by the browser. You can see some of these vendor-specific tags in here. And again, we don't recommend using those. Those are against our code quality guide. But it puts in some defaults for us so we can have some black text, and it has no indent and things like that. And then at the bottom here, this is something we haven't yet talked about. And this is our behavior. This is where our JavaScript starts to come in. And so my primary goal is to get this button to do something. And it's our introduction to JavaScript. And what's nice about the console is that it allows us to just write JavaScript into this thing. And JavaScript as a programming language looks and feels a lot like Java or C# or many other languages that most people have already seen. And so jump briefly back to the slides to say this is an often question that we get when there's this JavaScript thing, and from 142, 143, or other introduction programming classes, we learned Java. And so JavaScript is just a variant on Java, right? Except not. So some analogies for you. It's like grapefruits and grapes, and hamsters and hams, and catfish and cats. And so like these things have similar words, but are not quite the same. So JavaScript is what we call a C-like language. And so languages that are that come from this family of languages include JavaScript, include Java, includes Perl, it includes C#, and a large number of other languages. And because they all come from the same family, a lot of the things that you would use in Java or C or C# or C++ are going to look a lot like the same things. So let's pop back to the console. And for example, I might want to define a new variable, because that's one of the early things that we learn how to do. So I might say that this is a string variable. And so I now have a string variable. And so like other languages, like Java from 14x, this looks pretty similar. We have the name of the variable, which is string variable. We have the assignment operator, the single equals, and the actual value of the variable. In JavaScript, the way we print things is very similar to our system.out.println, except we use something called console.log. So we are logging some information to the console. Okay. We also have things like a for loop, which again is going to be almost identical to something that we might see in other languages. And so I'll scroll back up because I should have done 10 rather than 100. But we have the for, we have the initialization, we have the condition, we have the incrementer or the action to take afterwards, and we then have the body of the loop. So this is almost identical to something like Java, or pretty much all C-like languages. And so we've got those, and we also have things like arrays. And here you'll start to note that our typing is a little bit different, as noted in the chat. So we're defining variables with let, but we don't define a type. JavaScript tries to guess it for us, and so that makes it dynamically typed. We'll see more of that as we go on. I'm not going to talk more about it here. And so because, and the reason I'm not going to talk about it more here because JavaScript has a lot of interesting features between the dynamic typing and a few other things. But its power is not from these language features. The power comes from the environment that it's running in, which is the browser and running in HTML. And something that we know from doing HTML and CSS is we have this thing called the document object model. I'll pop back to the slides for a second. And part of what happens in the document object model is we have this thing on our browser, within our browser, that is our content, that is our structured content. And since we have this document, I'm going to move on. Problem with reference slides is it doesn't have exactly what I want to talk about, but that's okay. So we have we have access to this document. We've transferred it over the internet to our computer, and we now have this HTML here. And this is where the power of JavaScript comes in. And what we can do is things like we can get the document, and we can run selectors on this. So just like in our CSS, where we're defining these rules that have selectors and a list of declarations, we can also run similar type selectors in JavaScript in order to get specific elements. By the way, there's someone who's not muted. If everyone could check their mute status, that would be wonderful. So with JavaScript, once we have our document, which is its own object that we have access to as part of running JavaScript in the browser, we can run these selectors. And the Chrome dev tool does a great job at auto-completing things for us, like here, where all I've done is I've not even hit enter. I've not actually run this JavaScript code yet, but I'm checking this selector. And if you recall from our CSS, if we have no dot or £sign before the selector, it is just getting the elements within that match that element type. And so you can see Chrome is actually highlighting that for us, where it's highlighting that button. And this is not quite correct because I'm only getting one thing. If I wanted to get all of the buttons, I would actually do a query selector all to get all of my buttons. But one thing that you might note here is that this button actually has an ID. And so like in CSS, if we want to style a particular element that is identified by an ID, we do the my button, and you can see that that Chrome is highlighting my button, and I can hit enter, and we get some indication that it is that particular button. Okay, so we've kind of gotten our button, and since I'm here, we can also I'll define a new variable that has my button in it. And if I just type in that into the console, and I'll make this a little bit bigger, we do see that my button is the button. It is the HTML object defined in our source. So once we have that, there's a number of different things we can do. For example, and no, it's not linked to a file yet, but we're going to get there. So hang on. So one thing we might be able to do is look at the contents of that button. So there's a field called text content, and you can see that it is matching that text within those button tags. And I can even go so far as to say, override it. So this is starting to introduce the actual power of JavaScript, where I'm using code to modify the content and eventually we'll see the structure of the HTML. And so this is starting to get into our behavior of the website. You could imagine I just have that single line of code. It's not tied to anything else. I just hit enter and ran it. You could imagine potentially having that line of code attached to when the button is clicked or when something else on the page happens. Nikhil, you have a question.
When you changed the text of the button, it directly changed it in the code, the HTML code. So what if you wanted to go back to its previous state?
That's a great question. So one of the things the Chrome developer tools are showing is in this elements view, it's showing what is rendered on the page, what is displayed to me, the user. It's not showing what's in that HTML file. It's showing what it has interpreted and what the current state of the web page is. So if I refresh this page, and I'll come back, I have to redefine my variables. I'll override the button, and then I'll refresh the page, and we're back to the original state. So every time I refresh, it's getting the HTML from the network or a local cache. When I run my JavaScript here, I am only changing what is currently displayed. Does that make
Thank
sense?
you. Yeah, that makes
Great.
sense.
Perfect. Ilya, I'm not sure I follow the question. What do you mean by a magic pass? Okay, yeah, that's a good point. So, good questions. Thank you for clarifying. So if you're not paying attention, if you don't see the chat or you're checking in the recording, we have a question that's saying, where did you get document.querySelector? Just kind of pulled it out of the air. And so what is document? What is query selector? Thank you. This is a perfect example of the kind of question I will address live. So couple of things. One is that when the browser receives the HTML from the network, so I type in something into the address bar, I hit enter. What it's doing is going to somewhere and grabbing that HTML file. It then parses that file and creates a document, and it creates this object that is a representation of the HTML document. And it just happens to define as part of that a global variable called document. And within that, JavaScript is mostly an object-oriented language. And so like in Java or in other object-oriented languages, I can do the dot accessor to get properties or methods within that object. And so as I was describing with the parameter that I passed to querySelector, it is exactly like the selectors we use in CSS, where I'm trying to get either an element by an ID or I'm trying to get a set of elements via the class. And the thing that we're passing in there is called a selector. And so one of the things you can do, especially with Chrome DevTools, is just type something and see what autocomplete suggests. So here, once I have the selector, I have two options. I have the query selector, which is going to give me a single element out of the document. In particular, it'll give me the first match out of the document. Query selector all will give me all of the elements that match that selector. Okay. So in my case here, I have an ID called my button. So I'm going to write a selector for my button. And that is giving me just that document, just that element out of the document. Okay, so just to make sure, I still have my button variable, and it has, oh, nope, I don't, because I refreshed, so I'll need to define that without the equals here. Okay. Nikhil, I will answer a slightly different question, which is to say that document is an instance of a particular object in JavaScript that the browser almost always, in our case, always defines as part of the page loading. So it's a particular instance of some type of class that represents the entire HTML document. Okay, so far, we've only kind of introduced JavaScript. Our button is still not doing anything, and I can click on it all day long and nothing is going to happen. And so we'll start to introduce, we'll look at maybe what happens when I try to check out the internet for answers. So if I say something like HTML button click, because when I click on the button, nothing is happening. So I want to look at what are some recommendations to do there. And we don't like W3 schools because things are out of date there, but we do like MDN. And so the first Mozilla Developer Network response is this click thing. That's not quite what I want because it's saying it's simulating a mouse click on an element. But it gives us some other words that we can maybe look up, like it fires the click event. So maybe if I look up element event within MDN, we're starting to get a little bit closer. We've got a reference to the most common types of events. If we look within here, sure enough, there is a click event, which is great. That's helpful. Because we're now saying that this is a thing that an element is receiving a click event. Okay, we're getting much closer. Let's look at some examples here. Aha, this is starting to look like something familiar. We've got our HTML with a button, and it has some text within it. We have our JavaScript, which we're defining a button variable. And they're, in this particular example, defining it as const. We're not going to cover that today. We might cover it later. So we're defining this variable with our query selector, which is the same as what we saw in the console. And we have this add event listener thing. Okay, there's a lot going on there, so I'm going to walk through it within our own JavaScript window here. So again, we can check out the autocomplete within Chrome DevTools to get some indication of things going on here. So the click is a type of event, and there's a couple of things we can do with events and elements. Excuse me. In particular, we can add event listeners to an element. What does that look like? Well, Chrome autocomplete is also helping us with what the parameters of this function are. We have a type of event that we're listening to, and we're having a thing that is listening. I'm going to go back to the documentation and see that if I'm using an add event listener and adding a event of type click, all I need to do is pass it as a string. So I can say click, and then I need to specify some kind of listener. And this is something that's actually going to be a little bit different than some other languages that you've seen around. So let's look in particular at the documentation for add event listener. The listener parameter from the documentation is defined as an object that receives a notification. So it's interesting that it's defined as an object, because you see a couple of examples is that it's either an object implementing the event listener interface or a JavaScript function. And that second point is something that is distinct from a lot of other languages, where functions and methods are kind of objects. They can act like objects in a lot of ways. We're going to choose to do the function part of it because that's going to be more similar to things that you've seen before. And so I'm going to back that out a little bit. And the way we define functions in JavaScript is to just say function, and then I'm going to name the function something like handle click. And for now, all I'm going to do is print something to the console so that I can verify that something is happening. So like all good programming, we're starting with hello world. And now we have a function defined. And I can run the function and see that it prints out hello world. Okay, so we have our function. And when we want to attach it to the listener, when we want to pass it as part of the add listener, so again, we'll come back to this. I need to pass the function like that, and I'm just passing the name of the function. And what this is doing is something called a callback. And I'm saying, I don't want this function to run right now. I want it to run at some point in the future. I am providing the add event listener thing with a reference to my function so that it can use it whenever it sees fit in the future. So I'm going to do that. As an example, if I were to do it a little bit differently, this is a common mistake. So don't do this. We do not want to see this, because what's going to happen, I click it and the hello world happens immediately. So there's a difference here between passing the reference to the function, which we do by just saying the name, no parentheses, versus the other one that has the do not do this. Frost, do you have a question? How would I reference a function with parameters? Yes, fair question. I'm actually going to pause on that, and we'll address that in some future content. You can do it. It's kind of interesting, challenging rather, in terms of introducing the language. And there's a lot of different language features that can handle that in particular. And so we will get there. But I'm going to ask you to be patient a little bit while we cover a couple other things first. All right, thank you. Okay. So when I'm adding just the event listeners, or I'm defining a function like this, what it's doing is evaluating that line of code on the spot. And if there's no result, it is undefined. So by just defining a function, I've defined the existence of this function, but the actual result in terms of things printed to the console or variables changed or whatnot is undefined. And so that's where this line where I'm saying add event listener, and I'm doing it wrong by calling handle click on the spot with those parentheses. It's doing two things. It's first executing that handle click function, which prints hello world, and then it is executing the add event listener. And it doesn't really evaluate to anything. It does some stuff, but it doesn't really evaluate to anything, and therefore it's undefined. Okay. Now we have this event listener, this handle click event listener added to our button. And so let's see what happens. I click it, and sure enough, I get my hello world, and I can click it as much as I want. And the console aggregates all those messages, so I don't see a bunch of the same message needlessly. And so it says I've clicked it 20 times. I keep clicking it, and sure enough, it keeps showing up there. But to a previous question, to a previous point, all of this is just happening within the Chrome console. And if I refresh the page and I click, I get nothing. So this isn't actually attached to our HTML yet. And there's a couple of nuances here in terms of what we want to have happen. And So what I'm going to do, I can only present one window at a time. So I need to switch to present this window. Nope, not that window. That one, yes. So here I have the actual HTML in for this page that we just saw. And what I want to do is, like our CSS, we introduce a new tag within the head of the HTML called script. And we define this with the script tag. And it's a little funky in that it's unlike the link tag where we actually do have to have a close script tag for this. And what this will do is when the HTML is loaded by the browser, it'll also load this JavaScript. So I'm going to open up my buttons.js JavaScript file. And so this is where it gets a little bit tricky. And I'm going to introduce this in a minute. So I'm going to do my query selector. I'm going to get my button and define a variable. And then do the same thing that we had before, where we have my button. And we're doing the add event listener, click, and I want to have a function named handle click that console logs, and put that as the event listener. So when I save and I have to change the share back to the window. When I refresh, we're actually seeing this cannot read property of add event listener of null from our JavaScript. And this introduces something that we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about on Friday, where there is no main function, no main method for JavaScript. It's based purely on a series of events. One of the events we're going to look at is how to detect when the browser has finished loading the page. At that point, we'll actually have access to the document and can avoid this cannot read property add event listener of null thing. Because right now, the JavaScript cannot find the button, even though I had exactly the same code that we had from the console. We're going to examine that more on Friday. In the meantime, please ask questions. Please check Ed. And we will see you in section tomorrow and on lecture on Friday. I'll call it there. And as usual, we'll stay on for a few minutes. Thank you, everyone. Yes.